The smell of cheap coffee and photocopied paper hung in the cramped office like a fog that never lifted. Dr. Michael Chen pressed his thumb against the edge of his desk, feeling the familiar splinter that had been there for 3 years. Or was it 30 years? Time had a way of folding in on itself lately, like origami made from memory and regret. Rain drummed against the single window, each drop a tiny fist knocking at the glass. Beyond it, the university quad stretched out in shades of gray and green, students hurrying between classes with backpacks held over their heads. Michael watched them with the detached interest of someone observing fish in an aquarium until one figure stopped directly below his window. She didn't run. Everyone else ran when it rained like this, but she stood there. Her designer handbag held uselessly at her side, her cream-colored coat already darkening with water. Even from 2 stories up, he could see her lips moving, probably complaining to someone on the phone about the weather, about the walk to class, about whatever minor inconvenience had disrupted her carefully curated day. His hand found the coffee mug without him looking. Muscle memory from countless mornings just like this one, except this morning wasn't like the others. This morning, the coffee tasted different, brighter, like possibility. "Professor Chen?" A knock at the door. "Your 10 o'clock is here." Michael set down the mug carefully, watching the dark liquid settle into stillness. "Send them in." The door opened and she walked in, trailing the scent of expensive perfume and rain. Her heels, red-soled, he noticed, the kind that cost more than his first car, clicked against the old linoleum with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. "Sorry I'm late, Professor. The rain, you know." She didn't sound sorry. She sounded like someone stating a fact that should be self-evident, that the world should accommodate itself to her schedule. "Miss Zhao?" He didn't stand. "Please sit." She folded herself into the chair across from his desk, legs crossed at the ankle, posture perfect. Her mother had paid for etiquette classes, he remembered, or rather he had paid for them, or would have paid for them. The tenses tangled in his mind like fishing line. "I wanted to discuss my grade on the midterm," she began, pulling out a stapled packet of papers. Her nails were painted a soft pink, professionally done. "Yeah, I don't think the B- accurately reflects my understanding of the material." Michael picked up a pen, a cheap plastic bic that he'd found on the floor of the faculty lounge, and tapped it against his desk. 3 taps, the same rhythm his heart had beaten in that other life, in that hospital bed, when the machine started screaming and the nurses came running and everything went dark and quiet, and then, "Professor?" He blinked. She was staring at him with those wide, dark eyes that looked so much like his brother's eyes, like the eyes that had looked at him across a dinner table and said, "She's family, Michael. Family helps family." "The grade is accurate," he said. Her perfect posture stiffened. "But Question 3. You cited Morrison's work on comparative literature, but failed to engage with the actual text. Question 7. You summarized the plot when the prompt asked for critical analysis." He set down the pen. "You did the minimum required work and expected maximum results. That's not how this works." Color rose in her cheeks. Not the attractive blush of embarrassment, but the mottled red of anger. "I worked hard on this." "Did you?" The question came out softer than he intended, almost gentle. "Or did you assume that showing up and looking like you belonged would be enough?" She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "My uncle used to say that about me, that I expected everything to be handed to me, but he was just—" She paused, seeming to search for the right word. "Bitter. He worked these awful jobs and he acted like it was everyone else's fault that he couldn't make something of himself." Michael felt something cold settle into his chest, heavy and familiar like a stone he'd swallowed. "Your uncle?" "Had." Past tense. She was already moving toward the door, dismissing him as easily as she'd dismissed 1,000 other inconveniences in her life. "He died, like years ago. Anyway, I'll be speaking to the department head about this grade." The door clicked shut behind her, and Michael sat alone in his office with the rain and the coffee and the weight of all the lives he'd lived. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the bottom drawer of his desk, the one that stuck unless you pulled it at just the right angle. Inside, beneath a stack of ungraded essays and a forgotten sandwich from last week, it was a newspaper clipping he'd cut out 3 months ago. Or 3 years ago. Or in another lifetime entirely. Local man dies from heart failure. Michael Chen, 42, passed away at Mercy General Hospital. The paper was yellowed at the edges. though he'd only printed it this morning. He'd gone to the university library before dawn, when the building was empty except for the security guard, a woman named Rosa who always smiled at him, who didn't know that in another version of the world, they'd worked the same night shift together at a warehouse on the east side of the city. He'd searched the archives for his own obituary, the way other people searched for their family trees. The brief article mentioned his brother, Eric Zhao, and his niece, Vivian Zhao, 19. It mentioned his former employer at the warehouse, his landlord, his graduate advisor from 15 years ago who said something forgettable about potential unfulfilled. It did not mention the 3 jobs. It did not mention the $12,000 for Vivian's first-year tuition, the $15,000 for her second year after she'd decided the state school wasn't prestigious enough. It did not mention the nights he'd stood outside her expensive private university, watching through the wrought iron gates as she laughed with friends who wore clothes worth more than his monthly rent. It did not mention that he'd been writing a dissertation on post-colonial literature when his brother had called that first time, voice heavy with implications, that he'd been 3 chapters in, that his advisor had called his work groundbreaking, that he'd set it aside to pick up extra shifts, telling himself it was temporary, that family was important, that he'd finish it later. There was no later in that obituary, just a man who'd worked himself to death for someone who couldn't remember his name correctly. Michael folded the clipping carefully, following the creases he'd made before, and tucked it back into the drawer. Then he pulled out a different paper, this one crisp and new, with the university seal embossed at the top. Welcome to the faculty. Dr. Michael Chen, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature. He'd earned his doctorate. He'd finished his dissertation in 6 months instead of 6 years, fueled by the strange clarity that came from having lived through your own ending. He'd published 3 papers in prestigious journals, had given talks at conferences, had built the career he'd abandoned in that other life. And when the position had opened up at Whitmore University, the expensive, prestigious school where Vivian Zhao was entering her junior year, he'd applied without hesitation. The rain was letting up, the drumming on the window fading to a gentle patter. Michael stood and walked to look out at the quad again. Students were emerging from doorways, shaking off umbrellas, laughing at how wet they'd gotten. He watched until he saw her again, the cream coat now thoroughly soaked, her phone pressed to her ear as she gestured angrily at nothing. His office phone rang. Chen. He didn't take his eyes off the window. Michael, it's Harold. Dr. Harold Kim, the department head. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone about to mediate a conflict. I just had a rather upset student in my office. Vivian Zhao. She says you're grading her unfairly, that you have some kind of personal issue with her. Michael finally turned from the window. His office, small and cramped as it was, felt suddenly larger, as if the walls had expanded to contain all the versions of himself. The exhausted warehouse worker, the night security guard scanning badges at 3 a.m., the weekend tutor explaining algebra to bored teenagers, the dying man in a hospital bed, and this, the professor with a spine. I'm grading her accurately, he said. If she has concerns about her performance, she's welcome to come to office hours and discuss strategies for improvement. But the grade stands. A pause, then Harold's voice, warmer now, almost amused. She mentioned something about her uncle. Noor said you reminded her of him. Did she? Said he was always working, always struggling. She seemed to think you might be, projecting some kind of class resentment onto her. Another pause. You know anything about that? Michael looked down at his hands. They were smooth now, the calluses from loading warehouse trucks long faded. Or not yet formed, depending on how you counted time. I know that everyone's got a story, Harold, and most of those stories involve working hard for things that matter. That sounds like a yes. That's the grade is fair and I'm hanging up now. Harold chuckled. She's going to be a problem student, isn't she? They usually are, Michael said, the ones who've never been told no. After he hung up, Michael returned to the window. Vivian was gone now. I disappeared into one of the buildings that ringed the quad, but he could see her clearly in his mind anyway, not as she was now, young and angry and entitled, but as she would be in 10 years in that other timeline. Successful, beautiful, engaged to some investment banker whose name Michael had never learned because he'd never been invited to the wedding. He'd seen her once in that other life, about 6 months before he died. She'd been back in town for some event, had posted about it on social media, photos of herself in designer dresses at a charity gala. He'd been finishing a double shift at the warehouse when he'd scrolled past the pictures on his phone during a bathroom break, sitting on a toilet in a stall with graffiti that said, "Management can eat shit," carved into the door. She'd looked happy. That had been the worst part. Somehow. Not that she'd forgotten him, but that she'd never really known him in the first place. He'd been a fact of her life. Like gravity or oxygen, present, necessary, invisible. Michael's phone buzzed. A text from his brother. "Vivian says you're her professor? Small world. She mentioned you gave her a tough grade. Go easy on her. She's sensitive." He stared at the message for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. In that other life, he would have apologized immediately, would have promised to review her work again, to see if maybe he'd been too harsh, would have tied himself into knots trying to be fair while also being family, never quite managing either. Instead, he typed, "Grades are based on performance. If she wants to improve, she should come to office hours." The response came quickly. "Come on, Michael. Family. Right? Right. Family." He set the phone face down on his desk and didn't look at it again. The semester developed a rhythm. Vivian came to class. She had to, he took attendance, but she sat in the back row, arms crossed, participating only when directly called upon. Her second essay earned a C+, her third, a C. She stopped coming to campus with the designer handbag, switched to something more subtle. The red-soled heels disappeared too, replaced by flats that didn't click so authoritatively against the linoleum. Michael watched these small changes the way an archaeologist might watch soil being brushed away from an artifact. Each layer revealed something that had always been there, but hidden. His other students thrived. He held office hours twice a week, and they came in nervous clusters, clutching their drafts and their questions. He taught them to read critically, to write with precision, to think about literature as a conversation spanning centuries and continents. "You're different from other professors," one student said, a sophomore named Maya who always sat in the front row. "You actually seem to care about whether we learn this stuff." "I do care," Michael said, and meant it. In that other life, he'd forgotten why he'd wanted to study literature in the first place. Somewhere between the warehouse shifts and the tutoring sessions and the slow death of his dreams, he'd lost the thread of what had made him love books, the way a good story could crack open the world and show you what was inside. Now he had a second chance to remember, to help others remember too. It was mid-October when his brother called. Not texted, called, which meant it was serious. Michael was in his apartment when the phone rang. A one-bedroom place near campus that cost twice what the studio warehouse apartment had cost, but that had heating that actually worked and windows that closed all the way. He was grading papers at his kitchen table, a cup of good coffee beside him. Not instant, not the burnt sludge from the faculty lounge, but beans he'd ground himself that morning. "Eric," he didn't make it a question, "we need to talk about Vivian." Michael set down his red pen carefully. Outside his window, leaves were turning gold and orange, drifting down to carpet the sidewalk. He'd never noticed fall before, in that other life, had been too busy working, too tired to look up. "What about her?" "She's struggling, Michael. Really struggling. Her grades are—" Eric sighed. "She called Mom crying yesterday. He said she might fail your class." "She's got a C average. That's not failing." "For Vivian, it might as well be. She's never gotten a C before." "Then this is a learning opportunity." Silence on the other end. Then, "What's gotten into you?" Michael leaned back in his chair, feeling the wooden slats press against his spine. "What do you mean?" "You're being, I don't know, cold. That's not like you." "Isn't it?" The question came out before he could stop it. "How would you know what I'm like? You're my brother? Am I?" Michael stood, began pacing the small kitchen. "When's my birthday, Eric?" "What? Why? When's my birthday?" A pause. "June something. July 19th. What was my master's thesis about?" "Michael, what the hell? What do I do for fun? What's my favorite book? Well, what did I want to be when I was 12 years old?" His voice was rising now, years of suppressed anger bubbling up like water from a cracked pipe. "What's the name of the woman I dated in graduate school? What happened to her? Why did we break up?" These are weird questions, man. They're basic questions. They're the kind of questions you should be able to answer about someone you claim to care about. Michael stopped pacing, pressed his forehead against the cool glass of his window. "You called me your brother, but what you mean is, you're family, therefore you owe us. You owe Vivian. You owe Mom. You owe everyone except yourself. That's not fair. No? When I said I was going to apply for PhD programs, you said it was selfish. That education was wasted on people like me, people who overthink things, you said. Yeah, but Vivian needed to go to Whitmore because anything less would be settling. He laughed, surprised by how bitter it sounded. Do you know how much Whitmore costs per year? We're not having this conversation about money. $68,000? Tuition, room, board, fees. Books are extra. That designer handbag she carried on the first day of class, $3,000. I looked it up. Her shoes, $1,000 each. And you called me and said family helps family. And I was supposed to just... He trailed off. Eric was silent on the other end of the line. I'm not doing it again, Michael said quietly. I'm not setting myself on fire to keep everyone else warm. Again? What are you talking about? You've never... Eric stopped. Are you okay? You sound weird. Are you having some kind of breakdown? Michael almost laughed. A breakdown. Yes, he'd had one of those. It had happened in a hospital bed while his heart gave up, while machines beeped frantically, while a nurse he'd never seen before held his hand because there was no one else there to do it. I'm fine, he said. Better than fine. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And where's that? Here, teaching, living my own life. What about Vivian? What about her? Michael, she needs to learn that actions have consequences, that showing up isn't the same as putting in the work, that the world doesn't owe her anything just because she's used to getting what she wants. He moved back to the table, looked down at the paper he'd been grading. It was Vivian's latest essay. Huinan Achebe's Things Fall Apart. She'd written 3 pages summarizing the plot and 1 paragraph of actual analysis. She needs a teacher, Eric, not a bank account. You're being cruel. I'm being honest. There's a difference. Eric hung up without saying goodbye. Michael stood in his kitchen, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone like it was a song he'd forgotten he knew. November came with frost on the windows and shorter days. Michael found himself arriving at campus earlier, staying later, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The university at dawn was peaceful. Just him and the maintenance staff and the scattered early bird students hunched over laptops in the library. He'd established a routine. Coffee from the good cafe on Main Street, the one that knew his order now. Americano, no room for cream, then to his office to prepare for the day's lectures. He loved this part, the quiet preparation, the way he could lose himself in the texts he was teaching. One morning, he arrived to find someone sitting outside his office door. Vivian. She looked different, smaller somehow. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate styles she'd favored at the semester's start. No makeup. The coat she wore was nice, but not designer, and there was a coffee stain on the sleeve that she'd tried to scrub out. I don't have office hours today, Michael said, unlocking his door. I know, Can we talk? Please? He considered saying no, considered walking into his office and closing the door, leaving her in the hallway with her problems, but curiosity got the better of him. Come in. She followed him inside, perched on the edge of the same chair she'd sat in that first day, but her posture was different now. Hunched, defensive, like she was expecting a blow. Michael set down his coffee and his bag, took his seat behind the desk. What do you need? I'm failing, she said bluntly. Not just your class, everything. I'm on academic probation. He waited. My parents are furious. My dad keeps asking what happened, why I can't just apply myself like I did in high school. And my mom... She laughed, sharp and painful. My mom keeps saying I should drop out, that college clearly isn't for me, that I should just marry rich and not worry about it. What do you think? She looked up at him, eyes red-rimmed. I think I don't know how to do this. Any of this. I thought it would be like high school. Where I could just... I don't know, show up, be charming, and everything would work out. But it's not. It's hard, and I don't know how to be hard. Michael picked up his pen, tapped it 3 times against the desk. Why did you come to Whitmore? Because it's prestigious. Because my parents wanted me to. Because all my friends from prep school were going to good schools, and I couldn't be the one who went to state? She picked out a loose thread on her coat. Stupid reasons. Are they? Wanting to succeed? Wanting to make your family proud? Those aren't stupid. But I'm not succeeding. I'm failing spectacularly. So change. She looked at him like he'd suggested she grow wings and fly. Change how? Start by being honest. Why are you really here, in my office, talking to me? Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Outside, so they could hear the sounds of the university waking up, voices in the hallway, doors opening and closing, the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner. My uncle died, she said finally. Did I tell you that? I think I mentioned it. You did? I barely knew him. He was just there, at family dinners, sitting in the corner, not saying much. My dad would complain about him sometimes, said he didn't have any ambition, that he was wasting his life working dead-end jobs. She twisted the thread around her finger. And I believed it. I thought he was a loser, thought he'd chosen to be poor, to be struggling. And now? Now I found out he was paying for my tuition. The whole time, freshman year, sophomore year, he'd been sending money to my parents, and they'd been paying the school. I thought my college fund was covering it. Oh, but there was no college fund. There was just him. Working 3 jobs so I could go to Whitmore and complain about how hard the classes were. Michael's hand tightened on the pen. How did you find out? I was home last weekend. My mom was drunk. She gets drunk sometimes, when she's stressed, and she just said it, like it was nothing. Your uncle would be so disappointed in you. He worked himself to death so you could throw away opportunities he never had. Vivian's voice cracked. Worked himself to death. Those were her exact words. The office felt very small suddenly. Michael could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the phantom ache of that other life. The exhaustion, the constant worry about money, the knowledge that no matter how hard he worked, it would never be enough. I want to see his grave, Vivian continued. Yeah, I asked my dad where he's buried, and he said he was cremated. No service, no memorial, they just scattered his ashes somewhere, and that was it. She was crying now, quietly, tears running down her cheeks. I never even thanked him. I never even knew. Michael stood, walked to the window. The quad was filling with students now, all of them hurrying to class, to the library, to coffee shops where they'd complain about their workload and their professors and how hard everything was. He knew, Michael said, that you didn't know. How can you be sure? Because if you'd known, you would have fought it. You would have told him not to sacrifice for you. And he didn't want that fight. He wanted you to have the opportunities he didn't, even if it killed him. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. They were true, had been true, but they were also a story he was letting go of. He wasn't that man anymore, wasn't the martyr who died for someone else's dreams. I want to be better, Vivian said. I want to actually earn this, but I don't know how. I don't know how to be the kind of student who deserves what he gave. Michael turned from the window. She looked young, sitting there, younger than 21. For the first time, he saw past the designer clothes and the entitlement and saw what he'd been too angry to see before. A kid who'd been handed everything and nothing, who'd never been taught that things worth having were worth working for. Start small, he said. Come to office hours. Actually come on the days I hold them. Bring your drafts. Ask questions. Stop assuming that understanding will just happen and start working for it. That's it? That's it. Everything else follows from showing up and doing the work. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Can I ask you something? Yes. Why are you helping me? You could just fail me. I deserve it. Michael sat back down, picked up the coffee that had gone lukewarm while they talked. Because I'm a teacher. It's literally my job to help you learn. But you don't like me. I don't have to like you to want you to succeed. He paused. And maybe I didn't like who you were at the start of the semester, but people change if they're willing to do the work. She nodded slowly, then stood. Okay, office hours. I'll be there Thursday. Thursday, he confirmed. She got to the door, then stopped. Professor Chen, thank you for being honest with me. I think my uncle would have been honest like that if I'd ever actually talked to him. After she left, Michael sat alone in his office, the morning sun slanting through the window, and thought about the man he'd been, the man who'd worked himself to death for someone who didn't know his name, the man who'd swallowed his own dreams so someone else could chase theirs. That man was dead, had died in a hospital bed, or maybe years before that, the first time he'd said yes when he wanted to say no. This man, the one sitting here now, was different. Harder, maybe. Less willing to bend, but also more himself than he'd ever been. His phone buzzed. A text from Eric. Vivian says you talked to her? Thank you. Michael deleted the message without responding. Winter settled over the campus like a blanket, white and cold and clean. Michael taught his classes, held his office hours, graded papers with increasing satisfaction as he watched his students, even Vivian, begin to grasp the material. She came to office hours religiously now, showing up with drafts covered in her own notes, questions that showed she'd actually done the reading. Her essays improved incrementally, C+ to B- to B to B+. Not straight A work, not yet, but honest effort honestly graded. I'm thinking about declaring a major in English, she told him one Thursday afternoon as the winter sun set early outside his window. My dad thinks I'm crazy, says there's no money in it. There isn't, Michael agreed, not compared to business or law or medicine. But you do it anyway. I do. Why? He considered the question, watching snow fall past the window in lazy spirals. Because I love it. Because teaching people to read carefully, to think critically, to see the world through different eyes, that matters to me. More than money? More than prestige? My uncle probably would have been good at this, Vivian said quietly. Teaching. My dad said he used to tutor kids on weekends, said he had a way of explaining things that made sense. Did he? Yeah. I wish I'd known him better. I wish I'd asked him about his life, about what he wanted, instead of just taking. Michael felt something loosen in his chest, some knot he'd been carrying. We can't change the past, only what we do with the present. That sounds like something from a fortune cookie. It is. I had takeout last night. She laughed, and for a moment she looked almost happy. The semester ended. Finals came and went. Michael graded the last essays with a red pen that was running out of ink, watching as the semester's worth of work culminated in final papers that ranged from brilliant to barely passing. Vivian's final essay was good. Not perfect, but thoughtful and well-argued, showing a genuine engagement with the text. He gave it a B+, which brought her final grade to a B-. She'd passed. More than passed. She'd learned. On the last day before winter break, as he was packing up his office, someone knocked on the door. Vivian stood there with a small gift bag. I know it's probably inappropriate or whatever, but I wanted to give you this. Inside the bag it was a book, a first edition of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, the novel they'd studied that had given her so much trouble at the semester's start. Vivian, this is expensive, I know, but I wanted you to have something that mattered. Something that shows I actually learned something this semester. She shifted her weight from foot to foot. There's an inscription. Inside. Michael opened the book carefully. On the title page, in Vivian's careful handwriting, to Professor Chen. Thank you for teaching me that showing up isn't the same as being present. I'm working on being present. V. Below that, in smaller letters. I hope this is what my uncle would have wanted, for me to actually earn what I was given. Michael closed the book, feeling the weight of it in his hands. Thank you. No, thank you. She backed toward the door. See you next semester. I'm signing up for your modern poetry class. See you next semester. After she left, Michael sat in his office with the book and the fading winter light and thought about what it meant to forgive. Not to forget. He would never forget what it felt like to die alone, unmourned, his potential unfulfilled. But to let go of the anger, to allow for the possibility that people could change, could grow into better versions of themselves. He thought about the man he'd been. Working 3 jobs, sacrificing everything. That man had been kind to the point of self-destruction. This man, the one he'd become, was kinder in a different way. Truthful even when it hurt, demanding even when it would be easier to indulge. Maybe that was the real gift of rebirth. Not the chance to get revenge, but the chance to live differently, to honor what had been lost by refusing to lose himself again. Spring semester brought new students, new challenges. Vivian thrived in his modern poetry class, her analysis of Sylvia Plath sharp enough to make him proud. She'd cut her hair short, stopped wearing makeup most days, spent more time in the library than at parties. They maintained a professional distance. She was his student, he was her professor, and neither of them was interested in blurring those lines. But sometimes, after class, she'd linger to ask a question or to mention something she'd read that reminded her of their discussions. I got a work-study job, she told him one day in March. In the library. It doesn't pay much, but my parents cut me off when I changed my major, so. They cut you off? Yeah, said if I wasn't going to take my education seriously, they weren't going to fund it. She shrugged. It's fine. I'm figuring it out. Took out some loans, got the job. I'm actually working for it now. Good for you. My mom said my uncle would be disappointed. That he didn't work 3 jobs so I could end up in debt studying poetry. Vivian laughed, but it sounded hollow. I think she's wrong, though. I think he'd get it. The working for something you love part. Michael felt that familiar ache in his chest, but duller now, more memory than pain. I think you're right. It was April when Eric called again. Michael had been avoiding his brother's calls and texts all year, responding with brief, polite messages that didn't invite further conversation. But this time, the voicemail Eric left made him listen. Michael, it's me. Look, I know things have been weird between us, and I know I haven't been the best brother. But I wanted to tell you that I've been watching Vivian change this year, and I've been thinking about what you said. About not knowing you. About only seeing you as someone who owed us things. A long pause. I want to know you. Actually know you. If you're willing to try again. Michael saved the voicemail but didn't call back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Some bridges once burned couldn't be rebuilt. Or maybe they could. But it took more than one phone call to lay the foundation. For now, he had his life. His classes. His students. His small apartment with good coffee and windows that closed properly. He had work that mattered, and a purpose that was his own. He had, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, himself. The semester ended in May with a departmental celebration. Michael stood in the faculty lounge, drinking cheap wine and listening to his colleagues complain about grade appeals and difficult students. He'd been nominated for a teaching award by his students. Wouldn't win, probably. He was too junior, too new. But the nomination itself felt like vindication. You've had quite a year, Harold said, appearing at his elbow with a paper plate of cheese and crackers. That Zhao girl really turned around. I heard she's considering graduate school now. She's doing well, Michael agreed. Her father called me, at the start of the year. Wanted me to make sure you weren't discriminating against her. And what did you tell him? Harold grinned. I told him his daughter needed to learn to work, and that you were exactly the professor who could teach her. He raised his plastic cup of wine. 2 second chances. 2 second chances, Michael echoed. Indeed, though he was thinking of chances that weren't second at all, but something else entirely. Stolen chances, borrowed time, the strange mathematics of living a life over again. Summer came. The campus emptied of students, leaving just faculty and maintenance and the quiet hum of research and preparation. Michael spent his days in the library, working on a new book project, an expansion of his dissertation, a publisher already interested. He ate lunch sometimes with colleagues, drinks after work at the bar on Main Street where the other professors gathered. He dated occasionally, nothing serious, but enough to remember what it felt like to be seen as someone other than the person who owed everyone everything. He was happy. The realization struck him one evening as he walked home from campus. The summer air warm and thick with the scent of cut grass and blooming flowers. He was happy in a way he'd never been in that first life, not even before the jobs and the sacrifice. Because this happiness wasn't borrowed or stolen or built on someone else's foundation. It was his. In August, an email arrived from Vivian. Professor Chen, I know you're not technically my advisor, but I wanted to let you know I've been accepted to Columbia's graduate program in English literature. I'm planning to focus on post-colonial literature. Your specialty, I know. You probably don't remember, but you mentioned once in office hours that you'd written your dissertation on Achebe and Kutsi. I looked it up. It's brilliant. I never told you this, but I went to the library and searched for my uncle's name. I found one thing. An article he'd published in a small literary journal when he was in grad school. It was good. Really good. Made me wonder what else he might have written if he'd had the time. Anyway, I wanted to say thank you for not giving up on me, for showing me what it means to work for something that matters. Vivian Michael read the email twice, then closed his laptop and walked to the window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the city, a version of him had died alone and unmourned. But here, now, in this life he'd built from the ashes of the old one, the death felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. He thought about his brother's voicemail, still saved on his phone. thought about bridges and foundations and the slow work of rebuilding. Then he picked up his phone and typed a message. Eric, let's have coffee. Just the two of us. I think we have a lot to talk about. The response came almost immediately. Name the time and place. Michael set down the phone and returned to the window, watching the sun slip below the horizon. The sky was beautiful. He'd missed so many sunsets in that other life. Too busy working, too tired to look up. This time, he looked. This time, he saw. Fall arrived again, the leaves turning and the campus filling with new students and returning faces. Vivian stopped by his office on the first day of classes, looking different again. Older, more confident, wearing the kind of simple elegance that came from knowing you didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Just wanted to say hi before I leave for New York, she said. And to give you this. She handed him a folder. Inside were copies of that article he'd written in graduate school. The one he'd published in that small literary journal before his brother's first call, before the jobs and the sacrifice and the slow death of dreams. How did you... I tracked down the journal. It took some work. They'd gone defunct years ago, but I found an archive. She smiled. I made copies. Thought you might want them. For your records or whatever. Michael looked down at his own words, written by a younger version of himself who'd still believed the world was full of possibility. Thank you. No, thank you. She glanced at her watch. I should go. Flight to New York in a few hours, but I'll stay in touch, okay? Let you know how grad school goes. I'd like that. She reached the door, then turned back. Or Professor Chen? Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think people can make up for the things they didn't do? The times they weren't there for someone? Michael thought about his brother, about the coffee they'd shared last month and the careful conversation that had followed, about his mother, who'd called to apologize for things she didn't fully understand but knew had hurt him, about the slow work of forgiveness, which wasn't the same as forgetting, but might be the same as healing. I think people can try, he said, and sometimes trying is enough. Vivian nodded, understanding something he hadn't quite said. He'd be proud of you, I think, your uncle, for being the kind of teacher who actually teaches. After she left, Michael sat alone in his office with the copies of his old article and the afternoon sun slanting through the window. He thought about the man he'd been, the man he'd become, the strange journey from death back to life. In that other timeline, he'd died believing his sacrifice had been invisible, unappreciated, pointless. But maybe, the real point had never been whether anyone noticed. Maybe it had been about choosing each day what kind of person to be, what kind of life to live. This time he chose differently. This time he chose himself. And in choosing himself, he'd somehow managed to help someone else choose themselves too. That felt like enough. More than enough. It felt like everything. Years passed. Michael published his book, got tenure, became the kind of professor students fought to get into classes with. He attended conferences, gave talks, built a career that was solid and respected and entirely his own. Vivian sent him postcards from New York, then from London when she got a postdoc there. Eventually, she sent him a wedding invitation. She was marrying another academic, someone who studied James Joyce, and made her laugh. Michael went to the wedding, sat in the back, watched her promise forever to someone who saw her for who she was, not what she could provide. At the reception, she found him at his table. I'm glad you came. I wouldn't have missed it. She sat down beside him, her wedding dress rustling. You know what's funny? My dad keeps telling people that you were my favorite professor, that you saw my potential when no one else did. Does he? Yeah, I think he's rewritten history in his head. Made it so he was always supportive, always believed in me studying literature. She played with her wedding ring, spinning it around her finger. I don't correct him, but I remember how it actually was. Who actually helped. Michael sipped his champagne. People remember what they need to remember. Do you remember? She looked at him directly. The truth, I mean. About my uncle, about that first semester, about all of it. He thought about the newspaper clipping, still in his desk drawer at home, about the hospital bed and the machines and the nurse who'd held his hand, about the rebirth that wasn't magic or fantasy, but simply a gift he'd been given, the chance to live differently. I remember, he said. Good. Someone should. The band started playing, and Vivian's new husband appeared to sweep her away for their first dance. Michael watched them spin across the floor, her white dress catching the light, both of them laughing like the world was brand new. He finished his champagne and slipped out before the speeches started, drove home through streets he knew by heart, to an apartment that was his, to a life he'd built brick by careful brick. The next morning, he woke early and went to his desk, pulled out the newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile now, and read it one last time. Local man dies from heart failure. Michael Chen, 42, passed away at Mercy General Hospital. Then he tore it into small pieces and threw them away. That man was dead, had been dead for years now, even if some days it felt like no time at all. This man, the one who'd survived, who'd clawed his way back to life and meaning and purpose, he was different, stronger, harder in some ways, still softer in others. He was, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, exactly who he was supposed to be. On a Tuesday in October, 20 years after everything had ended and begun again, Michael stood in his office at Whitmore University and looked out at the quad. The leaves were turning, students were hurrying to class, and somewhere in the building behind him, a new crop of freshmen were discovering that college was harder than they'd expected. His hair was gray now, his face lined, but his eyes were clear. He'd written 4 books, mentored dozens of students, built a life that mattered. His phone buzzed. A text from Vivian. "Just got the news. I'm the new department chair at Princeton. Wish Uncle Michael could see this." He stared at the message for a long time, Uncle Michael. She still called him that sometimes, in her head at least. Confusing him with the man who died for her. He'd never corrected her, never explained that he wasn't that person, even though he was. Some truths were too complicated to speak aloud. He typed back, "Congratulations. You earned it." And she had. Every step of the way, she'd earned it. The afternoon sun slanted through his window, warm on his face. Michael closed his eyes and felt it. Really felt it. The warmth, the light, the simple miracle of being alive and present and here. In that other life, he died in winter, cold and alone and exhausted. In this life, he stood in the sun and felt its warmth, and he knew, bone deep, that he'd made the right choice. Not just for himself, but for everyone his choice had touched. He'd taught Vivian to work for what she wanted, to be present, to earn her place in the world. And in teaching her, he'd learned it too. The bell tower rang, marking the hour. Students poured out of buildings, heading to their next classes. Michael gathered his papers, his coffee, his bag. He had a lecture to give in 15 minutes, a group of nervous freshmen waiting to learn about post-colonial literature. He loved this part, still loved it after all these years. As he walked down the hallway, a student stopped him. "Professor Chen, I'm in your intro class. I just wanted to say, your first lecture was amazing. Really made me think about why I'm here, you know, what I want to get from this whole college thing." Michael smiled. "That's exactly what it should do. Come to office hours if you want to talk more about it." "I will, thanks." The student hurried off, and Michael continued to the lecture hall. He thought about the man he'd been, the man who'd died working 3 jobs for someone else's dream. He thought about what that man would say if he could see this life, this moment, this choice. He thought that man would approve. More than that, he thought that man would be grateful for the second chance, for the courage to choose differently, for the wisdom to understand that helping others didn't mean destroying yourself. Michael reached the lecture hall, opened the door, and stepped inside. The students looked up, expectant and young and full of possibility. He set down his bag, picked up a piece of chalk, and began to write on the board. "Good afternoon," he said. "Today we're going to talk about what it means to be present in your own life, what it costs, what it gives, and why it matters more than anything else in the world." Outside, the leaves continued to fall. The wind carried them across the quad, golden and orange and red, each one a small surrender to the season, each one beautiful in its brief descent. Michael taught his class, and the sun moved across the sky, and somewhere in the city his brother was reading a text he'd sent that morning about having dinner this weekend, and somewhere in New York his mother was looking at photos of Vivian's wedding and remembering a son she'd taken for granted, and somewhere in Princeton, Vivian was sitting in her new office and thinking about the uncle she'd never known and the professor who taught her what it meant to work. And here now, in this lecture hall on this Tuesday afternoon, Michael Chen was exactly where he was supposed to be. Alive, present, free. The lesson ended. The students filed out. Michael packed up his things slowly, savoring the quiet moment before the next class, the next meeting, the next small piece of the life he'd built. As he left the building, stepping out into the October afternoon, he looked up at the sky, blue and endless and full of light. He'd worked 3 jobs once, in another life, had died for someone who'd never known his name. Now he had one job, the right job, and he'd live for himself. And in living for himself, he'd learn to help others live for themselves too. That was the real rebirth. Not going back in time, not getting revenge, but learning finally that the most radical thing you could do was choose your own life. Claim it. Live it fully, without apology, without sacrifice that destroyed you. Michael walked home through streets dappled with sunlight and shadow, and he was happy. It was enough. It was everything. It was his.